When one looks at the actual cost of Bitcoin as well as fiat political currency, it is easy for us to look at the people right in front of us. It is much harder to look at the people that are on the sidelines, the people that don't necessarily have a vote in the system, the people that we don't necessarily think about on any particular day. However, they are critical to look at and to talk about when actually evaluating the cost of Bitcoin, apolitical money, or fiat currency, which is political currency, political money. My argument here is that Bitcoin could help prevent the deaths of up to 90 million people over the course of the next century, and therefore preserve 4.5 billion years of human life, plus a lot more benefits that we'll get to in just a moment. How? By accelerating the rate at which the world fights and combats and crushes starvation. Starvation is still a problem even today in the 21st century. We'll explore some reasons why that is the case and how Bitcoin can remedy these reasons. And Bitcoin's ability of helping preserve these millions, if not tens of millions of lives, and eventually, thousands of geniuses, right? If you have millions or tens of millions of people saved, that means that hundreds of thousands of those people are incredibly intelligent. Tens of thousands of those people are going to create world-changing innovations in their various niches of the globe. And that is going to result in Bitcoin price go up. The reason why Bitcoin is valuable, the reason why Bitcoin's price goes up eventually to millions and tens of millions and hundreds of millions of coin is because there are more market participants in the network competing for the underlying tokens. And so how early are you to Bitcoin? There are more lives, 10 times more lives going to be saved in the coming decades from Bitcoin's adoption than there are currently people using Bitcoin. Bitcoin's ability to helping preserve millions of lives and thousands of geniuses to develop new innovations is a part of the reason why Bitcoin will go to eventually billions of dollars per coin. So let's talk about starvation and Bitcoin and how Bitcoin helps alleviate starvation. Charity is one of the main ways at which people think about combating poverty in general or starvation and famine specifically. This is a noble act for multiple reasons. One of the reasons why charity to those that are less fortunate or economically disadvantaged, one of the reasons why that's really useful and really important is because of the heartfelt reason, right? One of the reasons why you go and serve somebody is not only for the practical means of helping them, it is also to express that you care about them and that you love them. They are not a number on a screen to help. They are a human being to establish a connection with and share why you care about them, why you help them. So charity, of course, always has its place, and it's always going to be needed through the end of time, right? That is really critical. Additionally, of course, there is the practical goal, or often more pragmatic goal, of trying to alleviate suffering for our neighbors, for these other people. However, these pragmatic results, that practical effects of our efforts, these only manifest on the assumption of productivity. You can't give food to a food pantry unless human productivity, technology, ingenuity, and economics has produced that food, producing it for you for the ability to give to that food charity, right? There is no such concept as foreign aid from a wealthy nation to an impoverished nation if that wealthy nation doesn't have superior technology and economics that they have the ability to give. And so I'm making it very clear here that this is not to diminish the role of charity, but this is to say that it is really important not only to focus on charity, but on long-term solutions that increase productivity and increase technology, right? Charity is on the assumption of productivity continuing. Now, one of the best examples of this is this chart that you see here, going all the way back to the 13th century, up to just a couple years ago. All kinds of countries around the world. Obviously, the best data is in the last 50 years or so. However, in a couple of examples, it goes back centuries, in some cases, many, many centuries. And what you see here is that continuously over time, we have been able to increase the number of calories per capita. And this has accelerated dramatically from the 1700s on, and even more dramatically from the 20th century on. In fact, since 1961, we have increased the number of calories per capita by about 50%, right? This steepening curve is because we have greater and greater needs, but also because we have greater and greater abilities. Despite the fact that since 1961, We have increased the world population multiple times over. Despite that fact that we've increased the global population, we've still had a faster rate of increasing the number of calories we're producing than the number of calories we are consuming. This is why people that have a zero-sum mindset when it comes to food produced versus mouths that need to be fed, this is why they fail. Even though, despite every single century, there are more people on the planet. We've been able to feed more and more people. Thousands of years ago, there were way less people than there are today. There were hunters and gatherers, right? And they had way less food than the average person does today. They had to work way more for way less than we do today, despite there being only tens of millions of humans instead of billions, soon to be 10 billion people on the planet. And how does this happen? This happens because of technological progress. A couple hundred years ago, there was a huge concern, similar to concerns about today, of global overpopulation, and we're going to run out of food, we're going to run out of farmland, there's not going to be enough nitrogen in the soil, we're going to suck out all the nutrients from the soil, we're going to run out of crops, and people are going to start to starve. And there are people, intelligent people, quote unquote, out there proposing, maybe we should kill off the elderly, maybe we should kill off the weak and the sick, right? This is a zero-sum kind of mindset that is valuing commodities, valuing money, more than valuing human life. This is anti-human, it is anti-Christian, it is immoral to have that kind of view, to have that kind of zero-sum mindset where if somebody eats, that means somebody else starves. The accurate worldview, the moral worldview, is one that is not a zero-sum mindset. So there was this concern that the globe was going to be overpopulated, be too many people, we're all going to starve, and blah, blah, blah. But there was the Fritz-Haber process. They innovated ways to reintroduce nitrogen into the soil and other chemicals that were needed to help, fertilize the soil and help us be able to produce more crops more efficiently, along with a lot of other innovations, of course, as the decades and centuries continue. But the point is, this technology did not exist in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when there were not even 2 billion people. And now today, there are well over 3 to 4 billion people that are alive today because they are eating food that has been produced with this process that did not exist barely a century and a half ago or so, right? As we develop new technologies, we increase our capacity to feed more people. Technology is what helps us grow capacity to help others sustainably without depleting the earth. Political currency, however, siphons this productivity. If you have prices denominated in a political currency and new productivity brings about more wealth for the entire share of a global pie, but then you have a political bureaucrat entering into that pie and diluting one's share of ownership of that pie, what you have is a centralizing power. You have a centralizing force. Why? To reinforce the monopoly of currency, to reinforce the monopoly of money. But the problem, of course, is that you're siphoning wealth away from literally the poorest individuals on the planet and giving it to the most connected, most powerful, most elite people on the planet. Despite technology aggressively trying to help us be able to serve more people and increase our global capacity and ability to feed, we have this fiat mindset, this political currency mindset that is more focused on regulated than on producing. Now, what we see, of course, is a direct link between economics and wealth and starvation and calories per capita, right? We have less in common with the near future than the ancient past. For the entirety of human history up until very recently, there was not enough food to produce for all the people on the planet. We now are in this really weird period that we have just barely entered into, where we produce enough food for everybody on the planet. This is the first time in human history we produce more food globally than there are people to eat that food, right? For the entire for all human history up to this point, we were producing not enough calories for all the people, and every single year people, would starve to death, people that didn't get enough food, right? Now we have, all hunger, therefore, today is preventable, right? All hunger of previous millennia and previous centuries happened because of the opportunity cost that we didn't innovate new technologies fast enough. Now here we are, we have enough technologies to feed everybody, right? And so, less in common in the future than the past, this is the first time in history that we produce more calories than what we need to eat, and therefore, all hunger of the 21st century now is fully preventable because we have enough food for the first time in history. And so power, energy, and economic stability are musts if you want to have that food be distributed for everyone in economically fair means, right? What you see in this chart here On the y-axis are calories or kilocalories. What you see on the x-axis is GDP per capita. Now what you see is a very clear trend here that the wealthier countries, towards the upper right corner, these countries have a lot more economic power per citizen, and of course they have a lot more calories per citizen. If you go, to the bottom left region of this chart here, what you see, of course, is the opposite trend, right? You cannot have a sustainable kind of country or culture or group of people that has enough food to feed its children in a country that is poor, right? These things are intrinsically linked, right? Economics and monetary theory may just seem like a number on a screen, but the reality is that these have direct costs to human life. And so what is the direct cost to human life when it comes to political currency? Well, the problem with fiat money, the problem with government political currency tokens, the problem with American death bucks is that there is a power vacuum inherently that is created with political currency. When you have a currency, when you tokenize the global share of wealth in a numerical system that is controlled and managed by a board of human beings, whether that's a monarchy or a democracy or a tyrant, whatever it is a human being filling that power vacuum, controlling the number of shares, the number of tokens that are distributed onto the whole planet, onto the civilization, the political entity, the political regime that lies within the borders of power of that person in charge, right? And the problem is that all human beings are sinful, all human beings are corrupt, no human being is omnipotent, right? No human being is perfect. And so if you have this kind of system, what you create is an incentive for perpetually more imperfect and perpetually more corruptible people to enter into that power vacuum and manipulate that distortion of reality, to siphon away wealth from that productivity that human beings, economics, and technology are producing, give a little bit more towards itself to reinforce the feedback loop of keeping power over the citizens of your political token system, right? This is called the Cantillon effect. We could talk about this, more at another time, but the point is, it is inherent to the political currency system that there is a power vacuum. And like I said earlier, all hunger left today in the world in the 21st century, all of it is fully preventable. The vast majority of it is the byproduct. In many cases intentional, in most cases not intentional. It is the byproduct of competition, war, conflict, economic sanctions, whatever it is, over that power vacuum of controlling a given political currency of a given geographic or political jurisdiction, right? For example, there are still today 22 countries that use the French franc. 22 countries, okay? Almost 24 countries use the French political currency. Why? Because the alternate is that local tyrants that would steal from their populations even faster than the French do would use those currencies, right? And it's worth mentioning that 20 of those 22 currencies are still in Africa, right? We today look back at the era of colonialism as some sort of horrible thing that happened long ago in the past, but the reality is that we still have monetary colonialism still today in the present. Now again, of course, there is a lot of things to be disgusted by this, right? When the French print French francs and those political currency units eventually make it down the way to Africa, what we are literally seeing is an accounting trick, an accounting deception, stealing wealth, resources, time, and energy from the populations of Africa and importing that energy, that monetary premium back into France, back into Europe, back into the Northern Hemisphere, right? And this is a horrible, disgusting thing. And we can say, oh, well, the French are the problem and we should revolt against them. We can say that as much as we want, but the problem is not the French. The problem is a systemic problem of political currency. If you kick out the French, you have some other new tyrant enter their place. And I would argue that probably most of the people that would fill the voids of these 20 countries in Africa would probably be even more oppressive than the French franc is currently onto them. One good example of this is that of Mali, Africa. Mali is one of these 20 countries that still uses the French franc. Now, I've never lived in Africa. I've never spent a lot of time there, but I have been to Mali, and I have spent some time there. I personally did have, some mission work I did there briefly a long time ago, and they use the French franc, right? They have a lot of hunger there, obviously a lot of poverty. They're one of the poorest countries in the world, right? These are children that are going to grow up in an entirely different life than I've been blessed to grow up in simply because of where they were born, right? An entirely different life. However, despite myself and many, many other people doing even more efforts than I've done, even all the foreign aid, despite all that energy flowing into impoverished nations, trying to support the local populations, trying to give them clean water, trying to give them education, trying to give them medical supplies, trying to give them food and resources to help them be more sustainable. Despite that, inevitably, there is a power vacuum. And if you have a geographic region with a political power vacuum where there is monetary monetary wealth to steal, where there are resources to steal, where there are wages to steal, right? You're going to have this honeypot problem, right? And this is the underlying problem of political currency. You create this honeypot problem. And so using Mali as a very sad and unfortunate example, I was there many, many years ago, right? But unfortunately, in 2017 onwards, there's been Al Qaeda and other terrorist groups that have re-entered into the region and tried to take over. Many people have died. And as a result of that, the hunger rate in Mali has doubled since 2017. So since I've been there, and again, there was a lot of hunger there when I was there, right? That rate has doubled because of the instability that has occurred from the fighting over the power vacuum of the resources there. And that is just one example. There are so many other examples that could be had there, right? You can look at this one chart of daily supply of calories per person from 1800 to 2022. You can see the United States in blue, the world in orange, Mali in green, right? You can see it. There's been tremendous growth since the mid to late 20th century into the 21st century. This is a wonderful and beautiful thing, thanks to the result of many charitable efforts as well as a lot of technological progress. However, in the last 6, 7 years, whatever it's been, that hunger rate has doubled again because of these kinds of conflicts, this kind of fighting over the honeypot problem. Now, what is the global number, right? Zooming out away from a country, what is the global number? The global number is that we currently make enough food for 10.5 billion people. And this is why the folks that have a zero-sum mindset and think that we're going to run out of food just simply don't understand. Yes, there are problems to creating more food for another couple billion people that are going to be born as the global population grows. Yeah, sure, there are problems to that. But remember that barely just a couple hundred years ago, we were not even at 2 billion people. And there was very valid reasons to believe that we were eventually going to run out. But new technology, new innovations, new improved efficiency allowed the possibility for more human life, and it reduced the rate of starvation despite us having more people, right? And so we have more than enough food. We already have enough food for 10.5 billion people. And by the time there are actually 10.5 billion people alive on the earth at the same point in time, we're going to make way more food than we need for 10.5 billion people, right? It is not a zero-sum game. However, despite us making enough food for 10.5 billion people, we still have almost 1 billion people malnourished and hungry in famine to varying degrees. There's all kinds of terminology behind it in different terms, right? But still, we have a significant portion of the world population, about 10%, that is hungry. 90% is not hungry. That is a wonderful achievement. But that 10% still is, because political currency is a zero-sum game. That is winner take all, right? 800 million currently in hunger, 113 million, give or take 10, 20 million, whatever, in quote-unquote acute hunger, meaning that they're an even more extreme state. And the death toll is about 1%, a little over 1% of that 800 million in any given year, about 9 million people a year. That is the cost, the indirect second-order effect cost of this constant game, zero-sum competition over controlled political currency, right? 3 million of those 9 million, by the way, about a third, are children. This is a disaster, this is horrible, and this is ongoing. It is very easy for us to be afraid and panic to things we don't understand, but we become so complacent with things that are just normal to us. It's easy for us to just kind of look on by it, right? We get very scared of the Bitcoin volatility moving a couple percent in a given day, but become very accustomed to the annual rate of theft from political currency, right? The same kind of mindset here. We become terrified of the prospect of a few hundred or a few thousand or 10,000 people dying here or there, wherever, somewhere in the world from some horrible event, in some plane crash or in some natural disaster, whatever it is. And those things are horrible, and technology does remedy those kinds of disasters. But this is a disaster that's unfolding right now, even in the course of this video, right? Even in the course of this video, a few hundred people have starved somewhere in the world. And a majority of those deaths have been the result of some fiat shenanigans somewhere else in the world, right? This is a crisis. This is a massive, massive problem. Now, we are going in the right direction for a wide variety of reasons, right? The world has been relatively peaceful since World War II, despite what all the headlines would say. We have been relatively peaceful since World War II as we default to more proxy wars and, more nation-on-nation wars, right? So there are a lot of reasons why. Obviously, technological progress is another part of that, right? So we are mostly going in the right direction. Not entirely, though. In 1990, there were a little over 1 billion people in hunger that were, malnourished. 10 years later, in the year 2000, we reduced that significantly, all the way down to 900 million. That's great and wonderful. We got really low in 2015 with 784 million people in hunger, and we're still bobbing around the 800 million mark, right? Progress has kind of stalled over the course of the last 15 years or so, right? But the trend on a long macro scale is generally in the right direction. However, inefficiency, conflict, turmoil, economic problems, these accelerate the problems of hunger. These accelerate the problems of malnourishment and the problem of death from starvation, right? The World Health Organization itself estimates that over 100 million people fell into hunger that weren't previously in hunger because of the lockdowns in 2020. People can pretend like economics doesn't have human cost or human ramifications, but there are real human costs. If you shut down the global economy, the wealthy parts of the world are able to handle it a bit better than the parts of the world that are literally already eating hand to mouth, right, from plate to mouth, right? When you have these kinds of consequences in the wealthy world, they're magnified by orders of magnitude in the impoverished world, right? And so the most critical thing, the most essential thing you can do if you want to minimize the number of children that are going to starve from they're going to die from starvation in the coming decades, the most effective thing you can do for all of them is reduce the probability of these destabilizing events, reduce the probability of war, reduce the probability of this honeypot problem of local tyrants and terrorist groups trying to take over, reduce the probability of fiat shenanigans, and slow the rate at which the poorest people of the world are having their wealth siphoned away to the wealthiest people in the world, right? That is the most effective thing that you can do to reduce the probability of starvation, right? Obviously, you can invent some new technology, right? One person out of a billion is going to invent some new technology that's going to save 1 million lives or whatever, right? And that's great. But the most effective thing you can do as an average person that maybe isn't that kind of genius that's going to build a $100 billion innovation, the most effective thing you can do is, by some marginal number, reduce the probability of that instability. We have built enough economic productivity over the last few millennia to reduce global food insecurity from 100%, where everybody was poor and everybody was hungry, everybody had to till their own land and go out and hunt in the woods for their own meal, right? From 100% of the world having food insecurity, all the way down to now about 10% of the world having food insecurity, less than common with the future in the past. The majority of the world was hungry and poor. Now the majority of the world is relatively wealthy compared to the past, right? This is a good thing. But again, less than common with the future in the past. The trade-off of what I just said is that now that 10%, that's all preventable. And the reason why it's still there is that we just don't have the urge to fix it. We just don't have the drive to fix it, right? All remaining hunger today, from the present moment and into the future, all remaining hunger is not from a shortage of productivity and new technological innovations. All hunger remaining is from the presence of inefficiency or corruption, much of which is the result of the infighting over political currency, the first order, or even in more cases, second order effects of that. Pursuit of controlling political currency is the main economic driver of inefficiency in these parts of the world. The more infighting you have, the more brain drain you have from these countries, the more dilution you have onto the world's poorest people or the nation's poorest people, and the more wealth inequality, immoral wealth inequality you have siphoning to the wealthy, right? The short-term charity is noble, right? I commend all of you that give and are charitable to those that are less fortunate, right? I'm saying that myself as somebody that has been to multiple countries, Mali and Africa being one of them, right? These are good things to support others, right? To give temporary aid and temporary need because it is desperately needed. These people are dying every single day, every single week, every single month, every single year, every single decade and lifetime and generation, right? These are real problems. They do need short-term charity. They do need short-term need. However, the greater the need, the greater supplies you supply these individuals, the greater the honeypot for somebody in larger gun diplomacy to take over, install new political currency means, and take power over their jurisdiction, right? Does fixing the money, does fixing the problem of a single point of failure in the underlying currency solve all these problems? No, but it greatly solves these problems, right? The historical key to upgrading the world's production and efficiency is the key to long-term sustainable solutions of helping the world's poorest people, right? You need both of these things. So let's talk about some practicalities. What causes world hunger today? Food waste is one of them. Poverty, wars and conflicts, climate change, quote unquote. Really, I prefer the word environmentalism. Natural disasters, social inequality, which again, that's a bit of a buzzword. Unfair global trade, poor governance, infrastructure, and job industry, right? And I think these things are true. We waste somewhere between 1/3 to 40% of the world's food. This is a disaster. Poverty is a very real problem. If people don't have savings, they can't tap into those savings to provide food for their families and children when they need to, right? Wars and conflicts obviously destroy productivity, they destroy free trade, and they trap innocent people in borders that they can't escape from, right? Environmentalism is really a major factor. If you have parts of the world that are being vastly deforested, or you have all kinds of species, all kinds of parasites, all kinds of disasters, destroying crops or destroying livestock, these have very real human costs, right? So what is the most efficient way to help people plan for an even longer term versus a short term? Being pro-environment is something that's very important. Another mission organization and trip I've been on multiple times actually is in Guatemala, right? Helping local families down there upgrade from an open flame stove to an enclosed flame stove helps them reduce the amount of wood they need to burn their stoves by 50%. What does that mean? That means you're cutting down half as many trees. That means you're slowing the rate of deforestation. And at the same time, you're helping the kids get more nutrition, get more food, right? Bitcoin, long-term apolitical currency, is the most effective way to help a society care more about what does the world look like 10 years from now instead of what is the profitability of this quarter, right? Not to mention the fact that we destroy a lot of forests for the sake of mining more gold out of the ground, right? Conflict of war, I feel like I've already talked about this with reducing the amount of infighting over control over a nation, meaning military might, economic might, and political currency manipulation, right? Food waste, of course, is something that's really important. A lot of people waste a lot of food. Why? Because of lack of long-term thinking, a lack of long-term planning, and an abundance of fiat foods, junk foods, and other kinds of foods that just aren't satisfying, aren't satiatory, right? Governance and tyranny, this is something that's really important. You have all kinds of tyrants out there, all kinds of megalomaniacs and people in control taking over their people, right? What is one of the ways they're able to retain that control? It is by diluting their political currencies into oblivion. Some nations are very powerful and therefore dilute very slowly, like the French, like the United States, like China, like Europe, right? Other nations, other countries dilute much faster because there's even less trust in those political institutions than there are with these larger superpowers like the United States, right? Of course, and poverty and a lack of stability in jobs, all these things are affected by the short-term thinking and massive inefficiencies of political currency. So where does Bitcoin plug into this? How can Bitcoin actually save lives in an intangible, indirect way, right? Some people would say, oh, Luke, it's not fair to say Bitcoin's going to save those lives because that's a second-order effect. Well, by the same token, we could say, oh, well, it's not fair to say that fiat shenanigans of war causes all kinds of starvation because that's a second-order effect, right? It's like, no, these things are definitely related. You can't separate one without the other. You can't have your little lockdowns in 2020 because you're concerned about some disease that's going to kill 1 million people or whatever, while ignoring the fact that you're going to probably send 100 million people into starvation over the next 18 months, right? These things are not inseparable, right? Everything has a trade-off. So how does Bitcoin actually potentially save these lives over the course of the coming decades and century? Here's my proposition. And of course, this is just a conceptual idea. I have no idea what's going to happen. I don't know what's going to be invented. I don't know what the wars, conflicts, or good things or bad things the coming decades are going to have, right? This is a conceptual thought experiment. Let's say that we are currently reducing the rate of global starvation by 1% a year. Let's say that's our current rate. Okay, that seems pretty good, right? That is a little counter to what we've seen in the last decade with hunger actually going up, unfortunately. But let's say we're reducing on average, with volatility, the rate of global starvation down by about 1% a year. That's a wonderful thing. That's a beautiful thing. That's millions of more people every single year that are escaping that bottom tier of society, right? Now, let's say we can increase that rate of decline from 1% to 2%. We're not talking about some magic Bitcoin utopia where all of a sudden within the next 5 years we eliminate starvation by 100%. We're not talking about some magical food drug that manifests steak ribeyes out of thin air by snapping your fingers, right? We're not talking about anything that is absurd. We're going from 1% on average rate of decline to a 2% on average rate of decline over the course of the next century. If we were to do that, and if we were to say that, hey, Bitcoin is going to be roughly about half of the world's assets, it's going to demonetize all these kinds of commodities, all these kinds of things that people go to war over and fight over. This is going to help the world, including the wealthy nations, get even more wealthy and therefore have more ability to be more charitable and support these more impoverished places of the world, right? It's like, hey, if we can assign Bitcoin to roughly half of that change, roughly half of that 2%, if we can assign 2 of that, that would save approximately 90 million lives over the course of the next century. You take that 800 million number, you factor in the global rising human population, you go from 1%, 2%, assume Bitcoin's half of that, that's about 90 million people. Maybe that's not what happens in reality. Maybe Bitcoin only prevents the starvation of 20 million people. Maybe I'm off by a factor of 10 and it only prevents the starvation of 9 million people over the next century. Is that still not a worthwhile cause? Is that still not something that you want to be part of, considering the fact that there are less than 9 million people active in Bitcoin today? Does that not mean that your impact still has some second order effect, that maybe your kids or your grandkids aren't even, or it's going to happen in their lifetime? They'll even be aware that you did it, but you'll know in your heart, you'll know in your mind that you had a clear conscience that you did the right thing, right? Now, considering the fact of how many human lives are lost every single time a child dies because some tyrant wants to prevent food from getting into their stomach, right? When you factor in the number of human lives, the number of human years involved here, we're talking about 4.5 billion years of human life that are probably going to be siphoned away over the next century if we only continue at this 1% annual rate of reduction of hunger. And if Bitcoin can just get involved, and over the course of the next century, slow right now, faster a couple decades from now, probably really fast by the end of the century, we're probably looking at literally billions of years of human life preserved because we're preventing this kind of starvation. And as a reminder here, this doesn't mean starvation gets to zero 100 years from now in the year 2125. This still means over 1 million people are dying every single year, a century from now, due to a lack of food, right? And so my point is, we potentially could do even better than that. We could still have 1 million people dying a year, a century from now, from hunger, and Bitcoin would still save tens of millions of lives on, I would argue, the low end. Why? Because first, not only do we have to talk about the number of people dying every single year due to hunger, which is 9 million, we also have to talk about the other 791 million that won't die from hunger this year, that are still hungry or are still severely malnourished, right? 800 million people every single year spend their entire year to some degree malnourished or in some kind of famine or some kind of food insecurity or acute hunger, right? That is 80 billion years in the next century of human life that could be significantly improved by meeting their basic food necessities, right? So we're talking about single-digit billion years of human life preserved over the next century, and we're talking about tens of billions of years of human life preserved. So that's the second thing to keep in mind. Not only the people who are going to die from hunger, but the people that aren't going to die from hunger this year that are going to live into next year carrying that burden of hunger into the following year, right? But the third thing to keep in mind, and this is potentially the hardest thing to calculate and the hardest thing to conceptualize, but it's probably the most important, probably the biggest number of all. The third thing that's critical is that if Bitcoin can reduce the probability of a global war at some point over the next century, right? Even if there's one global war, but Bitcoin prevents another second global war after that, right? If Bitcoin can only reduce the magnitude of a black swan event, or can reduce the black swan event entirely, right? If Bitcoin can just do that a couple times over the course of the next century, that is a tremendous effort. Imagine if the world was a little bit more efficient in 2020. Imagine if the world was a little less tyrannical or a little less chaotic in the year 2020 with all the crises going on, right? Imagine if instead of sending 122 million people into starvation like the World Health Organization cites, imagine if instead of doing that, we only sent half as many of those people into starvation. How many of those people would have been saved or would have been spared due to our decrease in political shenanigans and our increase in technological efficiency, right? So that's the third thing to keep in mind, is that what if Bitcoin prevents a single war or a single disease or improves efficiency to some degree or accelerates the rate we discover the next Fritz Haber process and increase global energy, right? Imagine if Bitcoin just changes one of those things. That can have a profound impact in the following decades by potentially saving extra millions of people that we can't even quantify, because that's a path of history that hopefully we don't even have to go down, we don't even have to explore. So my argument here is that Bitcoin is the single most effective way to prevent people, many of whom children, from going hungry in future decades. Yes, there's a time and a place to be charitable and support the people that are hungry and dying today. That is something that is very important. However, we also have to plan ahead for the billions of people that are going to be born. The vast majority of the wealthy nations of the world, like the United States, like Germany, like Japan, these have shrinking populations. The vast majority of the global south, Africa, Southeast Asia, India, these places have exploding populations. This is a really large demographic problem. We're going to have the wealthiest nations of the world shrinking in economic productivity and therefore shrinking in their ability to give foreign aid, to give all kinds of support for the needs of today and the future, right? We're going to have a shrinking of those economic powers, which could mean more conflict, could mean more war, will almost certainly mean less foreign aid, right? While at the same time, we have these other populations that are growing really, really, really fast. I'm not anti-human. I'm not saying they should slow down their growth, but I am saying that we have a very real energy crisis here. And we need to make sure that we are not only serving and stewarding to people today, but that we're planning ahead so that when the kid that's going to be born 30 years from now is actually born, by the time they grow up and they're 20 years old, 50 years from now, that they are going to enter a workforce and adulthood that is not rife with terrorism and all kinds of conflict and food instability, but hopefully they're entering in a world that is a little bit more sound, monetary soundness being a significant part of that. Billions of kids are alive today that need our help, yes, but even more billions of kids are going to be born in the coming decades. We need economic stability to incentivize technological growth and productivity growth to produce more food for more people. And we also need more stability for the sake of preventing wars and economic instability and political infighting, right? We grew global calories by about 50% in the last half century, right? That is tremendous. For people that say that we can't make tremendous amounts of change in short periods of time, that is remarkable, right? It took us thousands of years to increase our global calories by 50%. Then half a millennia after that. Then a couple millennia after that. In half of a century, we increased global calories for the entire world, despite an explosion in human population by 50% in half a century, in a single lifetime. Even if Bitcoin can marginally accelerate that positive change in the coming decades, where we have these demographic problems that we know are racing towards us, right? If Bitcoin can marginally accelerate that change from a 1% to a 2% rate, hopefully we can get to 3 or 4 or 5%. But even if we just go from 1% to 2% in the coming decades, that is a huge change. Or even if we don't increase from 1% to 2%, if we just prevent going from 1% to 0%, and either way, that is a massive impact on the generations to come. Bitcoin has the strong possibility of accelerating positive change and reducing the odds of negative change. So when somebody asks you, is Bitcoin too expensive? Why is Bitcoin priced so much? How much is too much? Should I get in now? Is Bitcoin too expensive? Bitcoin is cheap when it comes to the cost of human life. Sure, it might seem expensive in terms of political currency tokens, but keep in mind, political institutions are just printing more political currency tokens. Bitcoin is stupid cheap when quantifying it in terms of human life. Why? Because Bitcoin is proof of work, proof of hash, proof of electricity, proof of energy. Energy is not a zero-sum game. When I eat dinner, it does not mean that because I am eating my dinner that some kid in Africa is starving, right? The problem is not you're not finishing your meal or you're leaving a couple bites on the plate. The problem is that some terrorist or some political person out there is reducing the ability for some kid to get food, right? The problem with starvation is not the zero-sum game is not energy. The zero-sum game is the infighting and control over individuals, right? Bitcoin blocks occur roughly every 10 minutes, and they cost electricity to produce those new Bitcoins, to produce that new cost, right? Which is replicable, and it's not a zero-sum game, right? Just because Bitcoin miners use electricity to hash new Bitcoin, it does not mean that some person somewhere else is not going to be able to heat their home this winter, right? It's not a zero-sum game. However, political currency is a zero-sum game. If political currency's direct and indirect effects via a power vacuum are responsible for only half, let's say only half, let's say the other half of starvation is the result, the genuine result of people being lazy, or people like genuinely not having the means, or not being whatever, right? Like if you only want to assign half of the responsibility on the individual itself, which I think is not fair, I don't think that's fair to them, right? But let's assume only half of the reason why fathers in these impoverished nations are not able to provide for their wives and children. Let's say only half of the reason is because of their doing. And let's say the other half is because of the result of some economic power reducing their ability to receive the foreign aid that's being shipped to them, or reduce their ability to have economic sovereignty, right? Let's say it's only half of the reason. That's still a cost of 85 deaths per 10-minute period for fiat. If fiat had, quote unquote, blocks every 10 minutes, that's still a cost of 85 lives. Does Bitcoin intangibly result in 85 people dying every time a new block is added to the blockchain? No. No, it doesn't. Not even close to that, right? This is an irreplaceable zero-sum game. Every kid, every child that dies every few seconds or whatever from hunger, like that is irreplaceable. The watts that are spent hashing Bitcoin, that's replaceable. Go build another solar panel. Go dig out some more methane or oil or whatever, coal, right? But a kid, that is not replaceable, right? Bitcoin critics say, oh, Bitcoin is too expensive because it directly costs them electricity to produce it, or directly costs them political tokens to acquire it, right? People say, oh, Bitcoin wastes too much energy because it uses electricity. But guess what? There is a trade-off to everything. And if you want the trade-off of apolitical money that's defended by Watts, well, guess what? The benefit is you're not defending it with a proof of control network, a proof of gun network. That is political currency. Political currency is secured by the army. Political currency is secured by the military. Are militaries necessary? Yeah, probably to some degree, right? I think that's a very logical thing to say. But the political currency, the honeypot of control of the world's tokenized system, is a proof of control system, a proof of power, proof of gun, proof of weapon system, right? And so people that say Bitcoin's expensive because they're only looking at the dollars and cents instead of the human cost, even if indirect, those people have a small-minded, zero-sum mindset that prioritizes money and profits over human life. Honeypot currencies, proof of control currencies, proof of weapon currencies, proof of instability currencies are much more expensive than proof of energy currencies. Why? Because proof of control is a zero-sum game, and that power vacuum will inevitably be filled, whether it's by the French or it's by the Americans or it's by the local terrorist groups, right? It will be filled by sinful human beings, and it doesn't matter how good the person you put in charge is, they eventually will be replaced by somebody that is not quite as good, right? And so, to quote the Bible here, whoever oppresses a poor man insults his maker, God, but he who is generous to the needy honors him. Proverbs 14:31. So yes, definitely charity is good, and it is needed, right? However, the Bible also says, do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. So yes, it is important to sacrifice. It is important to sacrifice our energy, our time, our money to support those in need. But it is also important to sacrifice our comfort, our familiarity with the political currency system, and understand that the human cost of holding your American political death tokens in a bank, that is not free. Am I saying that you are directly morally responsible for the starvation of some kid in some other country because you kept your money in a banking institution? No, I'm not saying you're directly responsible, but to some degree, you should know that there is an indirect cost to that system preserving your purchasing power in that bank account, right? You should feel an obligation not only to sacrifice via charity in helping those of the world that are less economically fortunate than you, but you also should feel a bit of duty and sacrifice and moral obligation to support a network that doesn't have a power vacuum and therefore cannot allow these evildoers of the world to take power and say what is good is evil, what is evil is good, right? It is a Christian's duty to be generous in our hearts for the sake of God, not for the sake of our own personal glory or ego boosting, right? It is also a Christian's duty to serve and donate in temporary means in the present moment for the people suffering today, yes, but it is also a Christian's duty to create long-term solutions in supporting of others if you know that a crisis is very probably racing towards us and you know there is a technological or human remedy there right in front of you that has a possibility of reducing the odds of that crisis occurring and unfolding. To praise Bitcoin for your greed and number go up alone is selfish, right? To only be pro-Bitcoin and ignore all the people in the world that you don't think about or poorer than you, whatever, right? That is not good. And also, ironically, it's not pragmatic, right? If those people don't live, then your Bitcoin price doesn't go up as much, right? However, to ignore Bitcoin for your temporary gifts and charity, while ignoring this long-term strategic planning method, that is also unwise. We should love the Lord above all. We should give generously to those that need our help. And we should also advocate fiercely for things that prevent suffering for the poor. Even if these poor people we're advocating for, even if these malnourished people that we're advocating for and defending for are not yet born yet. Yes, we should love the people here in the present today that aren't yet, that are born, but we also should not neglect the children of the future that aren't born. Just because they're not here yet in reality doesn't mean that they are very probably racing towards us, right? So that is my presentation for today. And the lasting message here is simply this, is to think about those that are standing in line, the second order effects of whatever monetary system you use. It is a lie to believe that political money or apolitical money has a human cost. Bitcoin has costs, both positive and negative, right? And those can be remedied, right? But you have to remember that Bitcoin is significantly cheaper when it comes to the cost of human life. Why? Because all starvation today is fully preventable, and that number is really high. It's uncomfortably high. And even if Bitcoin can mitigate some small, seemingly trivial amount of this negative cost of political currency, that is quite literally the single most effective humanitarian effort of reducing global starvation of your entire lifetime. And so it is not only an encouragement of you to consider the cost of your ignorance of Bitcoin in terms of your missed opportunity cost of economic viability, but also to consider the cost, the human cost of the future. And are you comfortable with that? Personally, I am not. Thank you. Please subscribe. I'll see you in the next video.